There comes a moment when language becomes a prison, and the sound of one's own words, a mere echo of distractions. When someone takes a vow of silence for years, it's not the outer world that goes quiet, but the veil covering the soul that slowly begins to tear. Silence, contrary to what many believe, is not the absence of noise, but the presence of something greater, something dense, primal, that can only be felt when the inner screaming subsides. Those who remain silent for years enter a pact with the unseen. At first, the body resists. The tongue grows unfamiliar with stillness. The facial muscles forget. The dance of speech and the chest, that anxious drum, searches for new ways to express what burns within. But the mind does not quiet easily. In the first few months, it screams louder. It reacts like a caged animal, flinging thoughts like spears into the dark. The ego fights to keep its tyranny alive, with memories, judgments, and desires. And that's when the true crossing begins. Silence becomes a mirror no one else can hold for you. In it, you see everything: the masks, the broken promises, the names you carry but never chose. You behold yourself like an old house where every room holds a forgotten echo. The monk who chooses a decade of silence isn't trying to become a saint. He's trying to be stripped bare of words, of identities, of answers. By refusing to speak, he invites the inner chaos to one final feast. And there, among shadows and old wounds, he begins to hear the first true voice, the voice of being. There is an ancient practice taught in the oldest monasteries of the Himalayas. At sunrise, water is poured into cupped hands and slowly spilled over closed lips, a gesture of reverence to silence as a deity. A simple act, yet profound, as if to say, "Today I will not be deceived by the sound of my own voice." And then the sacred unfolds. Perception shifts. Heartbeats become prayers. The wind brushing against the skin feels like an old friend. All of nature seems to bow to the silence of the one who no longer runs from himself. But this is only the beginning. The true impact of silence on the body and soul has yet to be revealed, because what comes next is the unraveling of reality as we know it. The world, as we understand it, is held together by words. Promises, definitions, judgments, names. When someone stays silent for years, they begin to see just how fragile these pillars truly are. Names lose their weight. Ideas, once certainties, become drifting veils over an unfathomable void, and it is in that void that the soul begins to take root. When speech stops, the mind loses its primary tool of manipulation. Without the ongoing narrative, thoughts have nothing to cling to. Old desires begin to lose their flavor. The body, once trained to obey the ego, starts to align with another intelligence. Quieter, older. Posture changes. The eyes slow down, as if seeing not just forms, but the space between them. It is in the space between things that silence reveals its true alchemy. Over the years of silence, the perception of time dissolves. A single minute becomes a sacred eternity. A day can feel like an entire cosmic cycle. The monk who hasn't spoken in 10 years no longer walks with haste, for he is no longer moved by time, but by presence. Each step, a living mantra. Each breath, a rebirth. There are ancient accounts of ascetics in the forests of India who, after years of silence, began communicating with animals, not through words, but through vibration. They feel intentions. They read the atmosphere. This isn't cheap mysticism. It's a return to the original state, before language, before separation. But there is a price. To leave behind speech is to leave behind persona. And without it, the masks required for human interaction become unbearable. The silent soul begins to reject the false. It can no longer tolerate noise or hollow conversation. It craves what is real, raw, deep, sacred. That is why many who, embark on this path never return. Or if they do, they no longer fit the world they once knew. There is a silent practice among Tibetan masters, walking barefoot at dawn, feeling the earth as mother and the mist as a veil of the spiritual world. They say the silence that enters through the feet is more powerful than the silence that enters through the ears. For the earth whispers truths no human word can ever capture. And it is at this point that something begins to shift within the mind. It's not just silence, it's an opening, as if invisible doors start to swing wide, doors that hold memories not only of your own life, but of your ancestors, past lives, or perhaps the universe itself. What happens when those doors open? There are doors that can't be seen with the eyes, hidden portals in the heart of the mind, sealed shut by layers of language, fear, and distraction. When someone lives in silence for years, those portals begin to crack open, not with spectacle, but like a fracture in ancient stone, just wide enough for a breath of eternity to slip through, and in that breath, something deeply strange happens. Time stops making sense. Memories appear like floating visions, not only of lived moments, but of archetypal pasts, as if silence activated a forgotten library deep in the soul. Fragments of existence, faces you've never seen but recognize with tears, landscapes your body never touched, but your spirit calls home. In that state, the body becomes a living reliquary, housing echoes of lives that defy explanation. A pain in the shoulder reveals a guilt from another era. A chill at dusk brings the scent of ancestral loss. There are no rational explanations, only sensations, so deep the mind dares not reduce them to words. At that point, silence is no longer a choice. It becomes a sacred necessity. The mind, emptied of its usual monologue, begins to operate at a different rhythm. It perceives the invisible. It hears what was never said. Prolonged silence awakens a kind of spiritual listening. You no longer respond, you witness. You no longer interpret, you simply behold. And the world begins to speak in symbols. Bird song is no longer just a sound, it's an omen. A falling leaf carries the message of a necessary ending. A distant thunder becomes a call to an inner ritual. Monks who've lived in silence for decades report the same phenomenon. The realization that the visible world is just a thin veil over a vast field of subtle presences. They don't claim this as doctrine, they live it. They feel beings in the wind, messages in stones, and presence in the hours when the world sleeps. There's a rare practice, preserved in ancient lineages. Upon sensing the presence of the invisible, one places the left hand over the heart and closes the eyes, saying silently, "I am here." It is a gesture of humility and surrender, for in that moment, silence reveals its divine nature, not as absence, but as the dwelling place of spirit. But not everything that emerges from these invisible doors is light. There are ancient shadows, forgotten traumas, specters of the collective unconscious. And when they rise, there is no voice to call for help, only silence. And it is silence that teaches you no one saves you from the dark night of the soul, except your own presence. And at the center of that night, something deeper begins to stir. Absolute silence does not transform you, it dismantles you. When you reach the core of the dark night of the soul, there are no words left, no memories to take shelter in. You walk naked, not physically but spiritually. The skin of identities begins to fall away, and with it, the last names you used to recognize yourself: father, daughter, artist, seeker, awakened. None of these remain when silence calls you. Into the abyss, it is a brutal purification. The ego resists, whispering old fears, reminding you of the world you left behind, trying to convince you that this path is madness. But silence, that ruthless and compassionate master, simply watches. It does not bargain. It leads you until there is nothing left to cling to. At this point, many break. Some return to speech not by choice, but out of panic. The darkness of the nameless self can be unbearable for those who still crave definition. But those who remain, they find something that cannot be spoken because it does not belong to the world of sound. Sound. There is a moment described in ancient Taoist texts when the practitioner hears a sound that does not come through the ears, an inner sound like a hum or a subtle chant resonating in the center of the head. It is called the music of the void, not because it is beautiful, but because it echoes what lies beyond form. This sound arises when the spirit crosses the threshold of identity, when the body becomes temple and the mind an offering. At this stage, the practice is no longer ritual, it is renunciation. You learn not to move, not to respond, not to want. You simply hold the silence like one holds a cup of fire, aware that any desire may cause it to spill. And then, vision changes. Not your eyes, but your inner gaze. You begin to see with the soul. You see the suffering of others as reflections of your own. You see time as a serpent swallowing its own tail. You see the whole world as a dream, real, yes, but impermanent. And it's through this gaze that true compassion is born, not pity, not a desire to fix, but silent compassion, the kind that knows there is nothing to heal, only something to love. At this point, silence is no longer a practice, it is presence. It is the language of spirit. It is the ground the gods walk when they remember they are human. But there is one final crossing, the hardest, the most secret, because even after years of silence, there is still one whisper that must die. Even after silencing the lips, quieting the mind, and shedding every name, something still remains. A whisper so faint it nearly escapes notice. A desire hidden beneath all other desires. The desire to be someone who has silenced. This is the subtlest ego of all. It feeds on the very idea of transcendence. It wears silence like a cloak of spiritual glory. It hides in the serene gaze, the devoted rituals, the long vigils. But deep down, it still wants to be seen. It still wants to be special. This is where silence demands its final sacrifice, because true stillness does not seek recognition. It fades like incense at the end of the night. Its essence is disappearance. The being who lives in this silence no longer wants to be enlightened. They want to be no one, not out of despair, but out of transcendence. There's an old Zen teaching: when you realize you're at peace, cut off even that peace. Because even peace can become attachment, even silence can become a prison. And when that final whisper dies, the spirit is alone. Alone. Not in the sense of loneliness, but of purity. Without inner witnesses, without narrative, without effort. The soul rests like the surface of a lake before the birth of the wind. And in that stillness, something happens that no doctrine dares describe. A dissolution so complete that the very notion of I evaporates like mist under the morning sun. This is when many masters disappear from public life, not out of bitterness, but because they have nothing left to offer and nothing left to protect. They become invisible. Their eyes no longer judge. Their hands no longer seek. Their presence no longer teaches. It simply is. And yet something returns, a spark, a calling, not a thought, but a primordial memory. There is a world out there, screaming for silence. And so the pilgrim, the one who kept silent for years, returns, not to preach, not to prove, but simply to be. Their presence is like dew, silent, healing, fleeting. But not all will understand. Some will mock their stillness. Others will fear their gaze. Many won't be able to bear the mirror they've become. Because true silence does not comfort, it reveals, and what it reveals can be too much for those still running from themselves. And this is where the journey seems complete. But there is a shadow that lingers around this state, something even the deepest silence cannot erase. There is a subtle illusion that haunts those who walk the path of silence, believing it is a destination, when in truth it is only a mirror. Years may pass without a single word spoken. The body may become a temple, the mind a vastness. And still, something slips through. Something remains untouched, hidden in the innermost folds of being, because even when everything falls silent, the voice, the thoughts, the names, there is still an invisible escape, a final resistance, a hidden will to run from what you truly are when all else goes quiet. You can meditate for hours, fast for weeks, walk among trees like a spirit at peace, and still be fleeing. Not with your feet, but with desire. The desire not to face the core of your own emptiness. And this emptiness is not beautiful. It doesn't chant mantras nor offer visions of light. It is bare, raw, without promise, without meaning. This is the point where many turn back, not out of failure, but out of fear. Because true silence does not comfort. It exposes the most brutal thing of all, you, not the persona, not the seeker, but the one behind even the seeking. You sit, soundless, thoughtless, and suddenly you realize there's a part of you still screaming in silence, still thrashing, still wanting to run, even if it's into the arms of spirituality itself. And the most painful truth of all, even silence can be used as noise. You meditate, but you're still running from yourself. You fast, but still feed the desire to be seen as pure. You fall silent, but your heart still cries out for validation. So silence becomes a ruthless mirror. And in front of it, no prayer, no master, no retreat can save you. Only one question remains. Burning, persistent, inescapable, what inside you still resists stillness? The screen fades to black. The sound of the wind grows heavier. A single candle extinguishes. Slowly and still, you remain, because something within you is aching to awaken. Choose a new path, or keep feeding the same noise.